I remember being laughed at, feeling surrounded by groups of older boys and like being picked on as a collective group. I remember there was one incident in which I was thrown out of my wheelchair, so assaulted. Yeah. When I was between like 7 and 10, I sort of learned that if I can't be good at sport and I can't be seen or valued through that pathway, then I can be intelligent, then I can be smart. I've always had this love of learning and a desire to learn, and that was how I channeled a lot of what I was not able to express.
That's Alexander Arthur. He's a young man living with cerebral palsy who wants you to know there's more to disability than how it's often portrayed. Alex had a tough time of it growing up, struggling with bullying in his younger years and his mental health more broadly as he's gotten older. He's made major strides through therapy and committing to self-care, learning to love who he is and manage the tendencies that don't serve him.
I still have difficulties with self-judgment, self-loathing, and loneliness and relating to others, and I'm still working on that. The difference now is it's not the truth of who I am.
Alex's unique take on disability caused me to question my own perceptions, and I think you'll learn something valuable too. Welcome to Young Blood, the award-winning volunteer podcast dedicated to young men's mental health. My name's Callum McPherson, I'm a journalist, and this is a platform for everyday men to share lived experience stories and show that no matter what you're going through, you're not alone. Suicide is the #1 killer of young people, and changing that starts with speaking up. So let's do it. This episode has been made possible by Pro Realty Property Consultants. Pro Realty is a proud sponsor of the Young Blood Men's Mental Health podcast and a big believer in the importance of mental health awareness and suicide prevention. These legends swooped in with funding support at a time when we really needed it, and it's thanks to them we've been able to keep the show going. If you're looking for a commercial real estate agency you can trust to deliver quality, Pro Realty has a team of experienced professionals with the knowledge and expertise to provide you with a wide range of specialist services. Get in touch with their friendly team today to discuss how they can best assist you and mention Youngblood in your inquiry for a discount. Trigger warning, if you find anything spoken about in today's episode distressing, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14. Alex, how do you describe your disability?
I would describe my disability as a neuromuscular condition. So cerebral palsy is, at its core, a brain injury that affects muscle coordination, movement, balance, and stiffness.
And what was your understanding of it as a child?
My understanding before I started school was I knew I was disabled, but that existed as it is. There was no moral value attached to it.
Were you cognizant of all the limitations that you had?
Not quite. I think before I went to school, I remember being age 3 or 4, I grew up in Aldgate and I spent a lot of my time playing in my parents' backyard and around the hills of that area. So I was aware of disability. I was aware that there were some limitations, but not that it was bad.
How did your family explain it to you or speak to you about it?
I think my family tried to use appropriate language to explain that you might not be able to do, I don't remember exactly, but you might not be able to do things like get yourself dressed or... So they didn't tell me as much as they just showed me, like, this is what you're going to need help with.
And how do you remember feeling about that at the time?
Before age 4, I think I was kind of too young to really remember. But I remember feeling safe and taken care of. I have a wonderful family, and they were able to help me out with that.
So you didn't see it as a negative thing?
No, not at all. Not before primary school.
Okay. And what were the most notable differences between you and other kids?
I think the most noticeable differences was I just couldn't access the environment. So I had difficulties getting on like the slides at kindergarten, and I was not able to move as quickly, and it was just little differences like that I wasn't old enough to be bothered by, but were noticeable to other people.
So when were you old enough to be bothered by it?
I think I was old enough to be bothered by it when I started primary school. So this is 2004. At that point, society's understanding of disability was much less than what it is now. So I just remember, I don't remember the exact details or even timeline of being bullied. I just remember people noticing a difference and reacting to that difference with some fear or apprehension or confusion. And being children, they were like, oh, there's a difference. Let's pick on this person because he looks different. So I think, I don't remember exactly when, but I just remember not feeling particularly safe. And I think my first experience of indirect ableism, I think, was when the head of my primary school actually let me do some like physical or cognitive assessments. And because of my disability, I couldn't do the assessments in the same way as another child would. And so from that, she determined that I wasn't eligible to go to mainstream schooling. And if it wasn't for my parents' insistence that I do go to mainstream school, then I would have gone through the special education system.
And so how did that affect you at the time?
I don't It was more what happened afterwards. So I remember being laughed at, feeling surrounded by groups of older boys and like being picked on as a collective group. I remember there was one incident in which I was thrown out of my wheelchair, so assaulted. I now understand that's assault. I just remember not feeling safe, not feeling like I could express myself, and my reception teacher at that time would often yell at me for being late to school. She would single me out and shame me in front of other teachers, and she would get this close to my face and yell at me. And I was 5 years old.
That's unbelievable.
It was None of this is traumatic, but it predisposed me to not feeling relationally comfortable with other people, learning that I had to sort of hide being disabled and that I just had to get on with it.
Yeah, I can imagine that would have been so awful. And how it's shocking that someone would treat any child like that, especially if they're a teacher and especially someone like who's in your position.
There was wonderful support from the Mitcham Primary Link program at that time, and a lot of the student support officers were excellent in terms of physically helping the students get around, but also mentoring them. So there were good and bad components, and I have one particular memory that is bad. I remember being like 7 years old and being cognizant of, why can't I do this? And I was sitting on the edge of the Mitcham Primary Oval, watching everybody else play football and just going, I was sitting there just with so much unexpressed rage that I couldn't be like them. And that's when it sort of really hit me that I was different and not in a way that was appreciated or seen.
And what did you do with that? You were realizing that at 7 years old?
I think guess what any 7-year-old would do. I think that because I wasn't able to reason through it like an adult, I sort of learned, okay, being disabled means just getting on with it, means doing well at the things I know I can do well at, and sort of ignoring everything else. And I sort of fell out of love with my body at that time and learned to dissociate from uncomfortable, painful sensations. And
so disconnecting from your body?
Yes, very disconnecting from aliveness, really. And as a coping mechanism, I received a PlayStation for my 7th birthday and would obsessively play Gran Turismo, and
you must have been good.
I was good.
Like better than good.
And I would just use my PlayStation because that provided enough stimulation and it prevented me from really feeling lonely. I did have friends, like I still have really close friends from that time at primary school, but I just felt I felt very disconnected. I was one person at school, and I was one person alone. I was another person with family friend, and it just sort of, all of these different aspects of my personality started to separate out. And so I learned that I was like not worthy, not seen, and not cared for relationally, despite having a family that was supportive, loving, and was able to give me the resources that I needed and advocated ruthlessly for me.
So you weren't heard and seen outside of your family?
Yes, I remember not feeling like I was able to express what was really happening because, one, no one understands it, and I was determined not to be a victim at that time. That was my exact words.
Such a strong person for someone so young.
Thank you. And I did the best that I could, I think.
So you were disconnected from your body. What about your mind? Because you're obviously very intelligent.
Thank you. So when I was between like 7 and 10, I sort of learned that if I can't be good at sport and I can't be seen or valued through that pathway, then I can be intelligent. Then I can be smart. And I already had those skills. I remember my mother telling me a story of how I learned to read at 3 years old. I've always had this love of learning and a desire to learn. And that was how I channeled a lot of what I was not able to express.
So you would read a lot of books?
Yeah, a lot of books, a lot of video games. Like I was very introverted. Still am.
And performed well at school?
Performed okay. I did really well at the things I knew I was good at, and did really poorly at the things I was not good at. So I was very good at English, very good at like written expositions and phonics and language. Not so good at maths or science.
Yeah, same. And with the bullying, was that an everyday thing?
It was most days of the week. Again, like my memories from that time are quite hazy, but it was a lot of the time I just did not. There were certain people whom I knew would intimidate me, certain people that I knew that I could not be safe with because of their unconscious ableism.
And how did that develop as you got older and you got into high school?
Ooh, so we might have to jump back a bit in the timeline. You mentioned being dissociated from my body. When I was about 10 years old, I had what's called multi-level surgery, because at that time I could not walk from my front door to the path, so about 10 meters. It would have been impossible at that time for me to walk the distance from this door to the studio. And so, because I had been using a wheelchair a lot of the time and been using my walker to get around, I'd been using a lot of my upper body strength to compensate for the fact that I had cerebral palsy. So I had surgery which involved getting my hips bolted and replaced, so having hip plates put in, having my thighs rotated outwards, having my calves lengthened, making sure all of my bones that were aligned.
Was that multiple surgeries?
It was multiple layers of surgery in the one operation.
Far out. How long did the operation go for?
6 hours.
Wow.
And I remember feeling very scared.
Yeah.
I remember not feeling like I had any control. I do not remember that week in hospital at all.
How old were you then?
10. I was 10 years old. And I remember the exact date, February 10th, 2009.
And how did that change your life?
It changed my life because it made me afraid of pain.
All right.
It made me afraid of physical sensations, physical discomfort. And I learned pain is bad, pleasure good.
So you had a lot of pain after the surgery?
So much pain. I was on a lot of different medications in hospital. My muscles are spasming. So if you've got freshly operated legs and the muscle spasms, it disaligns everything. So it's quite painful.
Yeah. What about now?
I still have a lot of pain, and I contributed to my own suffering by not doing the exercises or the physio that I was supposed to be doing. And I had a lot of people at that time telling me what I should do, and no one was really asking me, through no fault of their own, why I wasn't doing the exercises. It was assumed that I would just do it.
And why weren't you doing it?
Because I was incredibly scared and ashamed of who I was already. So I just thought, if I can avoid the short-term discomfort and the suffering, then maybe things will improve, or I'll do it when I was ready.
And how did that work out?
It didn't work out well, as you can sort of imagine. If you've ever rehabbed from a sports injury, you would know that the rehab is the most important part of recovery.
Yeah.
And so I did enough exercises to keep sort of my physios happy, but not really enough, and it just made functioning so much harder. And developmentally, if you don't work on muscles when you're young or get into alignment, it can be much, much harder as an adult to do this.
So did it change your life in a positive way? Because you were able to then...
I wasn't able to realize sort of the positive. I was able to eventually walk in rehab, but I wasn't able to truly embrace what the positive was until I was much older.
Okay, so you really saw it as a bad thing for a long time.
I saw it as something that had to happen to me. I knew why. I was not prepared for it.
Okay. So did you feel more or less connected to your body when you were a bit older?
The long sort of term sort of dissociation continued throughout my teens. A lot of the themes of sort of social isolation continued, but there were sort of sparks of hope. I have a close friend at the time who I'm still friends with, who was autistic, and I didn't know why. And as sort of my academic interests developed throughout high school, for example, I was learning Japanese and excelling at that. I was learning English and really enjoying that, and sort of growing into puberty. I remember having an argument, I think it was like year 9 or 10, and I was so furious as to why he couldn't just act the way I thought people should act that I spent an entire hour in the library, like looking at autism on Wikipedia in an attempt to better understand what was going on. When I was in school, a lot of those same things continued. I was very isolated and I think I was very angry internally, but I had mastered the art of putting on a brave face and just going to school, as so many people do.
So did you feel quite shut down?
I felt disconnected, and also, and in the normal onset of puberty, there's a predisposition to anger or aggression.
And going through puberty is hard anyway for anyone because there's so many changes going on.
And then I didn't like the way I looked. It was okay and not okay. Like I was able to accept that the process was happening without liking it.
So self-esteem wise though?
God, no.
Wasn't any?
There was not a lot of self-esteem. There was not even a lot of self-compassion because I just ended up hating myself I just believed something was wrong with me, and that because something was wrong with me, that I wasn't lovable.
Did you voice this?
No, I didn't have the language or the skills. It was only much later in time.
What did it feel like walking around carrying that?
Well, physically it was very difficult. Being in a wheelchair, operating a manual wheelchair requires substantial strength and coordination. I was also sort of becoming aware of more times where the environments were not suitable. So going between classes was always quite difficult because for like a 5-minute gap to move from one end of a high school campus to another. And it can be quite challenging to walk, but there was also more understanding. So it's very difficult to say whether it was entirely good or bad because the two are intermixed.
I mean, also the anger that you felt that you weren't letting out in any sort of a way.
I just sort of numbed it out. I learned that expressing anger was bad and that feeling angry about my disability was wrong because that would have equated to me being a victim of it rather than appearing to be in control.
Did that mean that you were sort of vacant?
Yes, I remember a lot of times just sort of I didn't dissociate in the true sense, but I remember not being present for the moments of my life.
Being numb.
Yeah, I remember spending a lot of recess and lunchtimes either with only one other friend continuously or just alone because it was easier.
Did you have optimism for the future?
Did I have optimism for the future at the time? Yes. So I had optimism for like I really enjoyed learning and the skills, and I started doing a lot of voluntary work throughout high school. So I think my first experience of another culture was having a Japanese exchange student stay at my home. And at that time, I was very kind of energetic, appeared outgoing, wanted to learn, but the core was all of that was driven by a sense of needing to be perfect and achieving rather than truly embracing the life that was there. It was this theme of if I couldn't do something physical, I could do something intellectual. And debating really boosted my confidence. It enabled me to think critically through a very simple argument, and it enabled me to present my views.
And feeds into you doing law now, no doubt.
That was one of the seeds of doing law. But I also, when I was doing charity work, for example, a family friends organisation does work with children with disabilities in Africa, and I was able to do some fundraising work for that, and I was able to speak more openly about disability without fully embracing it. So I was able to be just vulnerable enough so people were able to see something, but I would only ever give them a glimpse.
What did it do for you being around other people who had disabilities?
In high school, there was a few other friends of mine from primary school who had disabilities, but there was not really a sense of relatedness. So I didn't relate to their experiences and they didn't relate to mine. We sort of...
Because you had different disabilities?
Yeah, we had different disabilities and different life experiences. So I don't recall ever feeling... I remember still being like friends with them, but not ever really relating to them in that deep way.
Right. So with all this going on, how did your mental health deteriorate more as you got older?
I started experiencing a lot. I had quite a few toxic relationship in year 11, not a romantic relationship, but just sort of group of friends, and feeling sort of not seen, not heard, not feeling able to be myself and submitting to control and authority, because when you're disabled, you naturally depend more on others, and there's more of a power differential between the caregiver and the person receiving. That's a theme I'll touch on later. But that was very interesting. I sort of learned to people please. I learned to hustle. I learned just to get by. And that was kind of it. I started experiencing more of what I now know as anxiety around year 12. Because when you're in high school, the end goal is the ATAR. The end goal is a set of numbers that gets you onto the next stage of life.
You feel a lot of pressure at that
There was
time.
a lot of pressure to, perform well and to use my intelligence in the best way possible.
And especially for you, because you made your intelligence such a priority, and
like my whole
disconnected from your
identity
body.
was based on,
Yeah.
achievement and acquisition, really. Or trying to get people to like me, people pleasing, denying, numbing. I was fine with the things I did well in, but it's sort of in year 11 and in year 12 particularly, even though that was a great year for me, I was doing subjects I really enjoyed. I had more friends, and I was starting to feel a little bit more like who I was going to be. It was still very difficult, and I remember doing a year 12 psychology exam and not necessarily being able to finish all the answers because I just was not able to manage the sheer physical stress of what I now know as anxiety. This, of course, got a lot worse when I left school. I went to schoolies and I had a lot of fun with that, including this is hilarious. I opened my notes section on my phone at the time. I was like, can somebody please help me crowd surf? And so I was just being carried throughout the festival crowds at schoolies in
Awesome.
2016. So there's a lot of really good things and a lot of really shit things.
Did the crowd surfing go on a bit too long, or?
I don't remember, actually.
You don't remember it? Oh, okay. What school is though?
It was everything happened so fast, and that was sort of
Okay, no injuries.
Child's first introduction to alcohol as well.
Yeah. Good times. Yeah.
So everything is intermixed. It's very difficult for me to separate what was good and what was bad. I just remember touching on certain memories and going, I didn't really like this or like that. You can cut all that out.
But you had a growing sense of anxiety.
I had just a growing sense of something is wrong with me, something is not good enough, and the intermediate beliefs of I should be perfect, things should be different, things need to be different, kept going. So
how do you describe the level of pressure you felt on your shoulders? And was that all from you?
That was mostly self-directed, yeah, in a sense that I really wanted to make something of myself and make a difference in the world. So it was intrinsic and extrinsically motivated.
So at what point did you access therapy?
So I accessed therapy a week before my 21st birthday. And to give you some background, I got into did arts for the first semester, and I transferred into law and international relations in semester 2 2017. And I remember just the sense that everybody was more polished than I was. Everyone dressed better. Everyone went to better schools. There was more social connectedness for the perceived in-groups than people like me.
Do you feel threatened by that? I
felt very kind of threatened, and sort of when you're a teenager, young adult, you have a lot of ways that you unconsciously defend against that. And so I sort of didn't like certain people because I believed that they were snobby or stuck up, and I would stereotype people very harshly at first instance. And when you start studying something like law, it's highly technical. It's very black and white. Like, these are the rules and these are the cases, and this is what you have to memorize. And I wasn't really equipped with the emotional regulation or academic study skills to really do well. So first time I had...
So it was overwhelming.
Very overwhelming throughout the semester. Hustle, work. And I remember coming home from uni multiple times and just collapsing, but not doing anything about that because that felt so normal. And so we just kept going. It kept cycling and cycling. And I remember walking into my principles of public law exam, and halfway through I just I froze. I was like, what the hell is going on here? I was reading the facts. The facts on the page weren't making any sense to me.
Because your mind is in overdrive.
Yep. Trying to solve all the problems. And to give some context for especially Rory here, a law exam is usually you've got 3 pages worth of fact that you have to reason your way through and give advice. So it's not about whether you know like the law straight up from a memorization point of view, it's logical reasoning. So I remember thinking, oh God, I had to leave the room, and I went to the bathroom and I was really hungry and I had a giant Snickers bar in my bag. I was like, I just need some chocolate. I need some more stimulation just so I can get through this bloody thing.
So did you finish the exam?
I did, but I didn't do very well. And the sort of a sense of shame of that I'd already failed just after I'd finished was another way of not feeling good enough manifested itself.
Yeah. So is that when you decided to see a psychologist?
No, this kept going for, this kept going for like throughout 2018. And even though I'd had a very long long bout of depression, for example, at the end of 2018, I finished my international law exam and I'd failed. So I'd barely passed my international law exam because I was shaking the entire way through it. Like my right leg, I just could not control what was happening. And then
it's pretty scary to
extremely scary.
Not understand it.
And even though I knew what I was doing, I could explain it in perhaps another way. In that context, it was very overwhelming because so much of a grade depends on an exam, and so many future opportunities depend on the collective set of grades on a transcript.
And you would have been thinking that your life depends on it.
Yes, that is exactly what I thought. I thought the rest of my life depends on this.
And then you were thinking about that and so couldn't focus on what you were doing.
Exactly. So, we thought it was just adding on layers of self-aversion and self-judgment and shame. And at the end of 2018, I got my marks back. I remember looking at the kitchen table, cried, and then just shut off. I think I was so exhausted from putting myself through so much. And this is at a time where I was definitely going out more and enjoying myself and generally socializing with people, but not truly authentically. And just doing that, and it got worse. And I somehow was like, right, and then a close family member passed away just before uni started. So there was a lot of different elements sort of in it early 2019. And this is despite the fact that I was appearing outwardly successful. I was doing, mock trials. I was going to uni. I was going out a lot. I have some very fun memories of when Mary's Poppin was hacienda.
Oh yeah, and back in the day.
Yes, and
so people would have said that you were doing well.
Yes, people would have. That was the image that I presented, and I had a very tight control over that. I was kind of funny, but not too funny. I was serious, but not too serious.
But you knew that really that's not how you felt.
That was not who I was at my core. And
so you're wearing a mask.
I was masking because that's just what I had learned to do. There was no other way that I had been shown.
We all know physical health and mental health go hand in hand, and that's why Young Blood has partnered with Athletic Greens to bring you the benefits that can help with both. You might have heard of AG1, the one-stop shop nutritional drink packed full of everything you need to support your mind and body. Just one daily scoop of AG1 covers all your nutritional bases and supports long-term gut health with 75 vitamins, minerals, pre and probiotics, adaptogens, a greens blend, and whole food ingredients. Think of it like a cheat code to give you more energy, increase mental clarity, better sleep, and improve digestion, all while boosting your immune system. You wouldn't think mixing all those vitamins together would taste great, but AG1 is actually delicious and really simple to make part of your morning routine. I'm not sure if you guys know this, but producing the podcast is purely volunteer, and I actually have to pay for studio time and editing. Every dollar we make from this partnership will go towards helping to cover production costs. So it's an awesome way to support your health, help the podcast, and contribute to young men's mental health all in one. If you're looking for a simpler and cost-effective supplement routine, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/youngblood. That's athleticgreens.com/youngblood. Check it out. How long did that go on for?
Throughout most of 2019, I have very hazy memories of the second semester particularly, because I was doing subjects that were much more difficult, like property and corporate law. And it was and trying just to understand something when I was so full of fear was not possible, because I was driven by perfectionism, overachievement,
And after it
on
had
safety.
happened the first time and you experienced going into anxiety
Yeah.
during your exam,
Or
going into
this-
future exams.
This was every single exam.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So after it happened the first time, when you were going into the next one, were you thinking this is going to happen again?
And it just sort of, over a longitudinal point of view, just kept building and building and building. Even though I had notes in front of me, I had everything that I needed, and I had over-prepared intensely. And I had often studied at the last minute and was not sure how to manage sort of the cognitive aspects of it, managing time, managing a diary. It all just felt too much. And so that was really it. And then, so some things started to go really awry later in 2019. I was approaching my 21st birthday, so I was under a lot of pressure to present at that time very, very well. I was also doing very difficult subjects and maintaining all the typical aspects of like a near 21-year-old's life. Despite having a fantastic 21st, basically a big old house party.
Nice.
With like a bubbles and bow ties theme. That was so much fun.
Nice, dude.
Despite doing all that and living the life and even like winning like an achievement award, I remember doing my corporate law replacement exam because I'd had a panic attack in the previous one and wasn't able to finish it. This was 2 weeks before Christmas in 2019. And I remember sitting in the exam thinking, oh fuck, this is happening again. And I tried reading. I did all the strategies. I tried reading the question. I tried calming myself down. I was just going haywire. And then my thoughts took a darker turn of, wow, what would it be like if we just ended things? What would it be like if, because it just, that need for relief was so overwhelming. And this is at the point where this is around the time where I started therapy as well and started working through all of that, which I'll tap into later. And then I just went there and I didn't act on anything. They were what I now would describe as suicidal ideations. And so as soon as I recognized what was happening, and as soon as after I made all the adjustments necessary, I flagged someone and I remember stopping. I asked the invigilator to leave. I broke down crying to the point where I actually my nose bled all over my jumper. And I remember trying to call Lifeline, and I was trying to make sense of what was happening through extreme overwhelm and sadness. But I couldn't, and that's just that was when I knew I need to take this seriously.
It's an intense experience.
And even before that, in one of my property law replacement, in my property law exam, the reason I got a replacement was I had actually just completely numbed myself out. I completely dissociated, and I somehow remember driving from town to my psychologist's office and be like, I need help immediately. I don't remember how I got there, but I don't even remember what happened for the days afterwards, but I remember getting there.
Wow, so it got really full on.
It got very, very, very intense, and that's when I thought, if I didn't do something about this, then I would be seriously injured or dead.
How did therapy help you?
Therapy fundamentally helped by creating a sense of safety. That is one of the main roles of the therapist-client relationship, is safety. And so I was able to explain what was going on. I was able to explain some of the things I had just told you. And I spent quite a few sessions shaking and crying a lot of the time. And just trying to slowly open to all of the ways to what was happening. And it was therapy is a very slow process. You've got to get to know the psychologist appropriately, and they've got to get to know you.
So what did you have to face within yourself to be able to move forward?
I had to face the fact that I was suffering. That was the first thing, to understand what I was experiencing was real and that it was not going to go away without work. That was the first thing. And to even feel the raw sensations of fear, to even feel what things like shame felt like, and to even, in many ways, start to grieve that unlived life.
Because you've been actively trying to not feel your whole life.
Yes, I'd been sort of partially, let's present this image of everything's okay, and like so many men do, because that's
But bearing everything and trying to not address it.
and trying not to address it.
Then you came to this point where you had to address all of it.
Exactly. It was very kind of, it came to the point where I thought, it came to that point where the choice was do this or or something bad's going to really happen to you.
What did you learn about how you were contributing to your own suffering?
See, that's an excellent way of phrasing it, because I had to open to the fact that I was contributing to my own suffering at all. Because I'd sort of, in so many ways, we blame other things, and we try to twist our own internal narrative so we're not at fault.
Of course.
And
being accountable is not easy.
Being accountable is not very easy, and I had to just learn to just sit with it. And the very first thing a psychologist did was he did what's called in acceptance commitment therapy a grounding exercise. So learning to breathe in a way that was stable, learning just to feel this body as it was, and just feeling all of the sensations and letting go. And then eventually we started the talking aspect of it, and those first few sessions were definitely rough, and it was not helped by the fact that I think I was a little bit isolated over the summer holidays, but also the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was in, I think, my 4th year of law. I was doing constitutional law. I'd also gotten a 1-month clerkship at a sort of a well-respected Adelaide commercial law firm as a clerk. And so throughout that, while I was still in the very beginning stages of not even processing, just acknowledging and being aware of what was happening, I was still fueled by a lot of anxiety and fear. When I was a clerk, I was presenting a let's hustle, let's get the work done, and it was genuinely engaging and enjoyable. I really learned how to hone my skills in that kind of environment. I worked a lot under pressure. I did, I was able to reason through a set of facts and do my research, so all great stuff, but I was not coping in ways that were healthy outside of that.
What were your coping mechanisms?
My coping mechanism is still wanting to overwork, so I was working from like 7:30 in the morning to I think sometimes 5:30, 6 p.m. at night. I was doing that 5 days a week, and because it was around that sort of end of 2019 to early 2020, it's sort of law 21st season. So it was people just having parties and me wanting to go out and have a lot of fun, and I did that. And because I was being paid for this clerkship, I had the resources.
Yeah. And
so I thought I would just present as this slick kind of commercial lawyer stereotype and look like I've got everything together.
Yeah. How did that go?
As you can imagine, it
wasn't quite like Suits.
Of course not. And Suits is an absolute lie. It is not possible to get ready for trial in 2 days. And I was kind of embodying that, and I was like feeling the fantasy. And so I was also, my GP had prescribed me some medication, and so I was.
So things were mixing together.
Things were mixing, and it wasn't great. And I remember one particular 21st, I was so inebriated that I went to sleep on the couch and ended up just making a complete mess of myself to the point where I needed like help changing my clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was so humiliating to me.
Yeah.
So like the person whom I was close friends with, who was like co-hosting this party, didn't speak to me for several weeks afterwards. And I sort of tried to brush it off and get rid of it, but that was at that point where I was like, I can't, because I keep doing this.
Yeah.
And so
it's been rough.
Throughout 2020, when the pandemic hit, I was on my law society. I was starting a psychology degree from scratch for the first time, doing 2 very difficult law subjects and doing it whilst over Zoom. And you can imagine the wheels really started to fall off then.
The world was seemingly ending as well.
Yes, and so while the world was
going on,
there was a lot that I needed to process, and it was very difficult.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult. And even when I remember just not handing in an assignment for several weeks just because I'd fallen into the depression cave yet again. And so throughout 2020, I did my absolute best to keep things going, enjoy the subjects I was enjoying, but it was very, very hard. 2021 things did start to improve, but it was very slow. Things really started picking up later in that year.
How long were you working with a psychologist before you started to feel like a different person?
It took Therapy is a slow process, and it took me, a good 2.5 years to start feeling like a human again.
Wow, it's a long time.
Yeah, and because these patterns had built up over such a period, I started to feel like a human, and I started really opening to all the ways, to the real source of the shame. I remember one session we identified like the core beliefs, the real sense, the real heart of what was going on. And that was tough. And that was when I realized, oh, this makes sense. And so things were starting to come together. I'd had a meditation practice since early 2020, and that had been an absolute lifesaver for me.
So were you dedicated to that on a daily basis?
Yeah, I tried to even just do 10 minutes a day, and that was one sort of small promise that...
Not easy to stick to. Like, I totally believe in the value of meditation, and I do it sometimes, but it's definitely one of those things that you can end up just being like, not doing.
That was my attitude towards exercise.
Yeah.
And physical fitness generally. And so...
Did you have a fitness regime too?
I went and saw... I still see a physio twice a week, and I have an exercise regime, but yeah, it was a lot of things things sort of started getting better, and I was doing really interesting subjects. And we're in 2021, I redid corporate law after the debacle the first time, and I'd gotten like my first I got my first HD for administrative law.
So what happened when you went into that exam?
That was completely different. So I really enjoyed the subject. I had this lovely man who taught my first law courses, and was just able to be that caring, humorous presence that made the law very easy to understand. And
how come you didn't have the same reaction when you got into the exam hall?
Because I had learned how to at least cope with the physical overwhelm. Even though I did my notes 9 days before my exam, because I realized, I've been having so much fun, I've forgotten to write this.
So what was the difference?
The difference was I was able to breathe, recognize what was happening, let it be there, and move through it.
Wow.
And then I started doing really well, and that was fantastic.
So how did that change how you felt about yourself?
I felt I had a lot more control and self-efficacy. So that was truly fantastic. And in 2021, I'd also started doing a lot more disability advocacy work. So there's a social profit organization called JFA Purple Orange, and one of the sort of subdivisions of that is Enabled Youth Disability Network. And so I'd gotten onto that by chance when my colleague just called me randomly out of the blue, and it was like, because I'd done some work with him previously, and it was like, would you like to be part of this? And I said yes straight away. And that was when I first started to re-relate to the disability community and start understanding that it's not just me solving the problems. I have to work with other people with various lived experience.
So at this point, you were really owning it for the first time.
I was really starting to come into my own. And really starting to I still didn't love myself. I was still fueled by not good enough, needing to get things done, getting things ticked off the list, and worried about lots of different ways I was failing. But it became less of the truth of who I was. And that started, I think, last year. I took a break from law and wanted to keep my psychology degree going so I could graduate and within a time frame I was happy with.
And why did you start doing psych as well?
I started doing psychology because I really enjoyed it in year 12. I thought, this could be something cool that I could get into.
But was it related to going through your own experience?
Yeah, I think that was relating it. It was going to my own experiences, and I thought I can finally embrace this without just needing to intellectualize it. And so that was still very difficult, having to learn statistics subjects and other courses, and managing all of the times and the dates and the ways I was working that's still difficult for me now. But it just kept on.
But you've come to really enjoy that.
I came to really enjoy that, and there was a period where I was in the foundations of health and lifestyle development. We were learning about child development and how children respond to various environments. And I was also doing social psychology. So I was learning how, from a big picture point of view, how our social systems and predictors and determinants influence the way we live our lives. So all of that just went, there were light bulbs just sort of going off, things I was able to really explore with and play with.
So you've been able to apply it to your own life?
Not strictly, but it gave me more of a sense of understanding and compassion. I remember doing a research on on complex post-traumatic stress disorder and Indigenous people, because Indigenous mental health is a huge feature of social psychology classes. And that's when it started hitting me that we have these minorities who've been dispossessed for 230 years, and these were the sort of flow-on effects psychologically that we're seeing. So it started to make sense as to why there's so much alcoholism and violence in some communities, and people not really having a strength of cultural resilience. I think another guest on this show, Michael Cullen, can speak far more to that than I can. But it enabled me to understand the social systems and the way, as a society, we include others and exclude others.
So you then had more of a focus on that and more of an interest in inclusivity and wanting to help other people.
Because it really just reawakened my interest in my interest in human beings and the way we operate and the collective problems that we face. And so during that time, I read a bit more self-help. I listened to this podcast in particular because I was very interested in.
We paid you to say that.
No. Absolutely, you did. And I actually had appeared on, I think, the Post-School podcast with Uncle Nathan at that time, and I was really able to start owning more of my. So that was in 2021, but owning more of my experiences throughout 2021 and 2022.
So what's your advocacy work involved? What do you advocate for?
So my advocacy work primarily operates through Enabled Youth Disability Network, or EDEN. So once we get board documents, we get all these policy initiatives that we're consulted on as a board. For example, we got consulted particularly on accessibility and construction standards within South Australia. And I got this email being sent around, and I was able to go, this is really fantastic. These construction standards make sense. However, what you're missing is the perspective of the renters under the Residential Tendencies Act. So there was no scope in that legislation for accessibility for renters. And that's still an ongoing policy problem. So I really was able to start seeing myself in the world through a much more psychosocial lens. And that really transformed my understanding of how the world works.
And what about helping other people actively? How's that changed your life?
I think, as stereotypically self-help as this sounds, humans are pro-social. So service is actually, acts of service and helping others actually helps us feel good. We're wired to connect. And you see this, if you've ever read some scientific articles on neurobiology, we have mirror neurons in our brains that enable us to relate to other people and share their experiences, which was just excellent. So my advocacy with Alexander was a side hustle that I started in February last year. It was just an account to have really honest conversations about disability and mental health in ways that were outside the norm of, self-help or scientific papers that were too difficult for most people to understand. And it was just trying to fill a need and trying to really explain what disability is like without viewing it as in a certain way.
What are your views about how men's mental health intersects with disability?
This is a great question that I'm still sort of exploring. But men's mental health is largely driven by what I call, in psychology, what is called self-efficacy. So needing to have autonomy and control, and it's very individually driven. And unfortunately, we're at the sort of point where men's mental health is it only happens to a subset of select individuals. It's a highly individual experience in and of itself. And there is a tendency to sort of pathologize or make a problem out of the men's mental health as an individual problem. So an example of if we experience something like anxiety, there's a tendency to blame oneself as the cause and then try to fix that. So I certainly went down this path. I read a lot of self-help. I tried to problem solve the issue, but I was either looking at the wrong problem, or I was looking at the right problem in the wrong way, or it just wasn't resonating with me. And so with disability advocacy, it can be very much the same way. When we see people with disabilities on social media, particularly those with physical disabilities, we frame it as this three-part: something's good, something bad happened, and then now we've overcome it. And so I wrote in my post called Disability and Toxic Positivity about the ways that we frame discussions around disability. And so an example of this is being called, "Oh, you're so inspirational." The reason that that's not a compliment is because it implies that, first of all, people with disabilities are inspirational just for existing. They're not. And there's this, it's not a compliment because it objectifies the disability, and then we get praised for that objectification when we're living up to able-bodied standards of what.
So do you mean that that's because it's defining you inherently as being less than?
I think it's sort of me being valued only when I'm doing inspirational things, or I'm presenting in a way that able-bodied people are comfortable with. So Stella Young has done a great TED talk on this called "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." I'd recommend Googling that to get sort of an idea of what it is. It's very difficult to explain. And I think that with disability advocacy, there's a lot more emphasis on the social determinants of health. Whereas opposed to men's mental health, it's very much about, you're the problem, it's only happening to you, and you need to solve it by talking about your feelings. So I think men's mental health could learn from disability advocacy by realizing it's not just you, it's your environment, it's the narratives we've been told again and again around what men should or should not be. It is the environment, so recreation, like all of these things contribute.
Well, you're talking about not judging yourself so harshly, or not having self-loathing there just because you don't live up to some standard that you've come up with. And understanding that there's more influences than just whatever you think to be yourself.
Yes. So these are called sort of social determinants of health. And so I still have difficulties with self-judgment, self-loathing, and loneliness and relating to others, and I'm still working on that. The difference now is it's not the truth of who I am. It's no longer a part of me, but it is something that I can experience. And it's from that place of self-compassion and self-acceptance that I'm able to approach it with a much more open heart. And so this is the trajectory. I was on this trajectory as an individual, from longing as a separate, alone, underappreciated or undervalued self, to a greater sense of integration and belonging. And that's the path we're on as a society. And so, yes, there is a lot of emphasis on individualism, but a lot of the rules in self-help are not applicable to people with disabilities because it's just simply not possible.
What's an example of that?
For example, do you often get up early in the morning and go to the gym?
Yes.
Okay. Let me step through for you why some of the barriers that I might face. First of all, I have to roster somebody on as a support worker. I have to give them personal details like my address and and then I have to be very comfortable with them physically getting me dressed in the morning and making sure I'm actually ready to go to the gym, which can be quite uncomfortable. I then have to go to a gym that is suitable for me, and I can use the equipment and do exercises in a way that is beneficial and safe. And all of this takes longer and is more exhausting than for a regular person.
Yeah, so then saying just get up and do it is a bit different for me than it is for you.
And saying just do it it's not that simple. I wish it was, and we're sort of starting to see that when we explore people who are neurodiverse. Saying just do it to someone who might have ADHD or autism, they might go, how or what? It's not resonating with them because it's not accounting for their experiences.
Yeah, so it's trying to apply the same rule to everyone, even though there are major differences.
And it can feel like self-help can talk down to people because it's not approached with real care and compassion.
Because it's saying you need to change.
You need to change, you're the problem. And this is why toxic positivity shames disabled people, is because it's saying that disability is a bad thing, it's wrong, and we don't like it. It's saying that we need to be optimistic and embody elements of hustle culture like resilience, grit, and optimism at all times across every issue in our lives. And if we don't, we're the problem.
Which is unrealistic because we're all human and we can feel more than one thing at once.
Exactly. And we're never supposed to live up to the ideals that we're set. They're sort of what some people describe as a North Star. They help guide the way, but you're never supposed to embody it.
Yeah, no one's perfect.
Exactly. And it's embracing that imperfection really, really tenderly.
So what is helpful in how we can speak about disability and view things differently?
Humor is a really important aspect of. So, for example, I often joke that I have 2 different ages, like 24 from waist up, 75 from waist down, depending on the day. Like, it's not that serious. Like, this is just actually how it is. And it's using humor in a way that is not overly self-deprecating, because that's a double-edged sword in itself, but that opens the space for discussion. And it's quite funny. Like, when I sometimes go out to the fringe or whatever, I have my companion card. And in effect, I often jokingly refer this to my friends as my CRIP privilege, because I'm disabled and I'm detoxifying that word. But it is a privilege to have access to these services and to get, to have a free ticket for something, because I can take someone that can support me.
And like you said to me before, you can feel grateful and you can still at the same time be suffering.
Absolutely. And the difference now is I'm able to recognize when that's happening and bring self-compassion. So, and that's really true. So I have started meditating a lot more. I've really started to explore sort of an engaged form of Zen Buddhism. So using the practices of meditation and mindfulness and that are restorative to effect social change in the world. And a leading light for me on this has been the teacher, and I think she's a retired psychologist, Tara Brach, who painted the meditation called RAIN. So it's to simply recognize what's there, to allow it, to investigate the physical sensations, associated beliefs, and so on, and then to nurture that with compassion.
Which is a bit metaphorical for your life and our lives overall. It's not about trying to fix the problem or trying to say this is wrong, we need to get away from it.
Exactly. And there's a Japanese art form called kintsugi, which literally means golden joinery. And it's when broken pottery or things are taken and they're reshaped, reorganized.
It's more beautiful
with golden glue, and it's more and exposing the perceived cracks or flaws makes it even more beautiful than it ever was.
Yeah, that's really nice. I've heard that before. So when we're trying to be motivational, positive online, right?
Yeah.
Where do we draw the line with that, or what would you say people need to be mindful of when?
I think when we're talking about disability, we need to do it in a way that's evidence-based. So being able to understand the literature and being able to read literature. I'm in a position of privilege on this because I'm doing a psychology degree, and I have the skills to do that and read the statistics and make my own conclusion. Other people may not. So it's really on the scientific community and our education system to help people get a baseline level of scientific literacy. First of all, then we need to use the evidence base and advocates as sort of through professionals to help change policy. So policy, if it's effectively rules or schemes designed to affect wide long-term change. And you asked before about the intersection between men's mental health and so on. If we look at problems like male suicide, for example, it can be seen, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, it can be seen as this individualistic problem driven by negative thoughts and beliefs and negative self-perceptions of oneself to the point where they are so overwhelming that death appears to be a viable option. Is that correct? Does that resonate with your experiences?
Yeah, I'd agree. That's a lot of what I've heard of.
So, but what we're not looking at is sort of the social inequities or the way the built environment is constructed. I'm no expert on this, but there's a lack of services. I think Zach Seidler has spoken about this on the show. There's a lack of male psychologists. There's only 381 registered male clinical psychologists in South Australia, according to the Psychology Board of Australia. There are more men that need help that can't seek it, and there's a lack of real policy or social change that is creating these big, broad spectrum interventions that we so desperately need.
And then there's still the attitude which we're trying to fix, which is, well, you're a man, you should just cope with that anyway.
And that's not the same attitude we would apply to another person or a friend of ours. So the men's mental health space we're on this shift from, as I said before, of longing to belonging. And the pathway forward for that is to really understand that we're all in this together, but also that it's not just this individual isolated pathologized problem. It really needs this.
Where it's like these people are weak, these men are weak, these men are stronger, therefore they suffer.
Yeah, or for example, I fixed my unmotivatedness by going to the gym. You know, for a person who might have something like ADHD, it's not quite that simple because there's often more barriers in place. So we need evidence-based policy and we need lived experience.
And what about that's very technical in terms of solution, and I agree with a lot of that. But what about just people who post on their Instagram and they're trying to do a good thing, they mean well? What are some of the things that we should be aware of?
Look at tone and context. So, for example, there's nothing wrong with posting things like going to the gym, but I have a particularly cynical interpretation of that. So someone might find it motivating, but others may not. So read the audience, reach out to as many people as possible, get some guiding influence or opinions, and be aware of whether you're invalidating somebody else's experience, providing advice that you may or may not be qualified to provide, or you're just reiterating what you've heard on social media without critically thinking through.
Because we do see quite a lot of that online where someone's obviously had their own personal experience and then they're trying to apply that to everybody else.
So there's a real disconnect between the lived experience and the application to social change that we need to see. So huge disconnect across so many areas. I think someone that's been very helpful in interpreting this in terms of women's rights has been Tarang Chawla, who frequently posts on his social media statistics about women that die by men at the hands of domestic violence. Very, very important. Ned Brockman is another example of what somebody can do when they run across Australia to raise awareness of homelessness. So now it's not about raising awareness. I think we're sort of at a saturation point. It's now about it's about waking up collectively and using our political systems and our social systems and the expertise of people like psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on to work in a more collective, harmonious way. That is what needs to happen. So it's about fact-checking, critically thinking, examining on an individual level, and looking at looking for nuance and patterns, and really expressing that.
Very well explained. And the binary you mentioned before between victimhood and Paralympians, when it comes to the media more broadly, and we see someone is on the front cover of the newspaper because they've got a disability, and now not just have they got a disability, but we're paying attention to them because they're trying to be a Paralympian.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that? How does the media portray more of a broad spectrum of people living with disabilities as just people who, if you're doing something worthy of merit, then we talk about it, but it's not for the fact that you're disabled, and you don't have to be an athlete to be worthy of attention? So
I'll address this in a couple of ways. So first of all, the standards for disabled achievement in Australian society are very much about, we're called inspirational for the low standard of achievement is being called inspirational for getting out of bed and walking along the street in the morning, like very ordinary things. But the standard of achievement becomes so much higher when you have to excel at a particular field to even have a discussion about disability. And that puts such an onus on the person to overcome or to work through and to embody the kinds of resilience that we want as able-bodied people.
Because it's like, we don't want to know about you and your story
unless it's prominent, or unless it's in a way that we're comfortable with. So speaking of truth to power is allowing people, is having firm boundaries around how we portray disability, but also doing that in a very kind way. So for journalists, it's about asking questions about the person, having a person-first approach, letting the person be at the center of the story rather than some sensationalist headline. It's about...
But also choosing who we're deciding to interview in the first place, right?
Exactly.
Right. So it's viewed, part of the issue is that it's only a story if it's about someone who's going to the Paralympics or who's trying to train to get there. So how do we see another story, and what other story do we see that
we need to explore different areas? So for example, students like me, we need to hear from them. We need to hear from disabled politicians like Senator Steele John. We need to hear from people with disabilities in all aspects of life and in a way that is intersectional. So we need to look at the intersection between disability and the queer community, disability and race, And so we get a far more nuanced, layered understanding of where disability fits in the context of our world.
Yeah, partly so that people who are disabled aren't thinking, well, I have to go and be an athlete.
Exactly.
If anyone's going to
you
give me any love.
You can just be. And it took me so many years to realize that as a disabled person, you are enough and you belong. Just because that isn't reflected back at you doesn't mean that isn't true.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
What are your aspirations?
I think my aspiration in life is to hold enough space for myself and my own needs while also intersectionally creating change for people with disabilities. So while I haven't decided exactly how I want to do this, I think I'd really love to be a mental health worker, either a psychologist or even psychiatrist, to help get a real understanding of the issues somebody is facing and to help them solve it in a way that suits them with the resources and skills that I have and the position where they come from.
So a big part of that is helping other people.
Yes, so helping other people and really just enjoying this life and this mind and body that I have. So not being so fixated on work, and taking the time to really rediscover what I enjoy and what matters to me.
Nice. You got a closing statement for us?
I think that people with disabilities are here. We have always been here, and we exist, we matter, and we belong. We deserve to be at the table. You just need to make the space for us, and we will contribute in ways, and we will change things in ways that you've never seen.
Well said, mate.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on and sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
That's it for this episode. If you like what we're all about, support us by following Youngblood Men's Mental Health on Instagram and Youngblood Mental Health on TikTok. And if you're already following, we'd love to get you more involved. Keep an eye out for our regular community question time posts on Instagram and drop a comment with your answers to join the conversation. Every podcast episode is recorded in professional quality video and they're all up on our Youngblood Men's Mental Health YouTube channel. So please show some love and subscribe. Thanks to our local business supporters, Herd Financial. You can find everything there is to know about the podcast at youngbloodmensmentalhealth.com. And most importantly, please share these stories with anyone in your life who needs to know they're not alone. We're all in this together. Catch you next time.